Hello. I want to talk today about a really interesting little data puzzle that I found today. I basically ran into a data point that I could not understand and I could not explain, and it just got in my head. I had to dig into it and figure out what was going on. I just wanted to share that with you guys. Um, to start with, I want to give you a little background. I started off, as I always do, calling Laura Ingraham a national disgrace. She is. She's terrible. What a disgrace. I was actually pointing in a Reddit article, making fun of Russell Brand, and I in this article I essentially say she takes a moment from her segment to say that America has 150,000 excess mortality. And in 2019, we didn't have this excess mortality, and the plausible explanation for it was, something's going on, and they're not telling us, and the medical industry is against us, and blah blah blah. And in practice, the year before, 250,000 people died of COVID. So that 150 number is almost certainly vast majority of people as COVID patients. And I've been pretty happy with that. That's a very simple understanding I have of where that number comes from that explains why so many people are being hurt. And it also makes me believe that the vaccine is not what's hurting people. And then somebody comes at me with this. I'll make this fuller screen so that we can so I can try and read it here if it's too small. The number of people, this is per 100,000 people. We'll go over this data in more detail. Compared to unvaccinated people, the number of people dying not of COVID, but of non-COVID related causes. And among this age population, which is 18 to 39, I believe, COVID deaths are approximately zero. So there are issues with getting COVID, with long COVID, with getting heart issues, and blah, blah, blah. But COVID fatalities are essentially zero. And now I'm looking at a data point that says if you have four vaccines, you are 3 to 4 times more likely to die than if you are unvaccinated. And I'm like, holy crap. How can this be true? My literal reaction was just not to believe it. Like I'm like give me your source. This is bullshit. Give me a link. This isn't true. So, guy doesn't give me a link, but he basically is like, "Hey, I've got the title here, age standardized mortality rates, ONS. So ONS is Office for National Statistics in the UK. I wasn't able to find age standardized mortality rates as a title, but I was able to find deaths by vaccination status in England. And I downloaded this Excel spreadsheet, which contains data from April 2021 to May of 2023. And that's the spreadsheet we have here in the background. This table is what I looked at. So it's got mortality, which is broken by COVID, non COVID, year, month, age group, vaccination status. And then there's a few more fields that I want to talk about. The number of deaths, and this number can be fudged. Like, for example, it's not that the second dose really protects you in the way that a first dose doesn't. There's just a lot more people who've gotten the first dose than the second dose. So the count can be misleading, and the number of person years can help you put this information in context. Luckily, the data set gives us a rate. This is the 100,000 person rate that the Reddit article I had shown you was quoting. This is all causes. So you'll see unvaccinated it's much higher here, but I'll show you a stripped down version of this. I convert this table into a pivot table, and I'll give you kind of the laydown of the pivot table. I have these same three fields up here, but they're aggregated. This is the sum of person years, this is the sum of deaths, and this is the average of the 100,000. The result of this is not perfect. This is not a perfect calculation, but it's actually pretty close. And I think it's really good for understanding what I think the person gets wrong reading this data. And a lot of that just has to do with the way this has been stripped down. A lot of people have been kind of misled on this one. So I want to show you January of 2022, just so we can talk through this data and read it in a way. But before we introduce this fourth booster, which I think is very interesting, the first thing to note is this is the rates. This is kind of our equal comparison, right? The third rate, COVID dose has a lower mortality rate than the unvaccinated, but it's kind of even around the second dose, and first dose is much higher. Now, because this data is specifically non-COVID deaths, a lot of this variation is essentially related to just kind of abnormalities in the data. Just if you have a sample of people where you only have 7,000, you might have some months where you have zero, and then you might have some months where it's higher, and that can cause some jumps to go around. But in general, it's pretty consistent. Like if you look at the rate of the unvaccinated, it really holds somewhere between like 45 and 60. Sometimes it's lower, like 30, sometimes it's higher, like 60, but 40 to 50 to 60 is the general range that I see it. Now, here's what's interesting. If we scroll and we look at these mortality rates right before the fourth booster comes out, you'll see something. We got about 60 deaths for this. Okay, this is the data we went over. We got the first dose has the most rate, and then it kind of goes down, and then the unvaccinated is a baseline, but it's pretty close. It seems that you have a lower rate of dying soon after a vaccine than after. I think that might have to do with how the time frames are represented, but I'm not sure how that's calculated exactly. But there is sort of a dead giveaway when the first dose of the fourth booster comes out, which is that the mortality rate is insane. This 500 people means a 1 in 200 person mortality rate per year. So this getting the fourth dose of the vaccine initially causes 1 in every 200 people who get it to die. But in the very next month, we will see a like 10% drop off, followed by a bigger drop off, followed by an increase, followed by a drop off. It kind of bounces around, but one of the things to note is that there's just not a lot of people who've gotten it. The fourth dose has like 4,000 people who've gotten it, whereas the second dose and the third dose are in the hundreds of thousands. This is a small sample of people, and more importantly, because they're the first people to get a fourth dose of COVID vaccine, I think they're uniquely vulnerable, right? Like if you look at the population statistic here, this is like 1 million people, 1 million 162,000 people. 4,000 of them have the fourth dose of the COVID. That is not 1%. That is a fraction of 1%, but it's so accountable for how many deaths there are. Whereas if you just keep moving on, just let time pass and do nothing else, look, the death rates go way down. Now that we're not in the 4,000 camp, now that we're in the closer to 75, 80,000 people, the death rate is a tiny fraction of what it was. The death rate appears to just kind of be descending, not casually, because it is a representation of real data. It will bounce around. It will go down. It will go up. You can see that there's more people getting vaccinated and there's an additional death. How do you treat this? Is this really an increase? Well, if you go back just months, fourth dose is 140, 96, 140, and then there's 30. What to make of that? The other thing to note here is not only does the fourth dose go way down as you stop giving it to just the most sick and most vulnerable people, but start giving it to more and more mainstream populations, is the people who are already vulnerable are no longer taking these other booster shots. So the odds of dying with the second or third shot are actually lower consistently than you get unvaccinated. Not because they help you not die from things that aren't COVID 19, but because anyone who is very sick and likely to die in the near future is a fourth vaccine group person. The people who are on third and second vaccine are the people who are not as vulnerable and not as likely to perish. So, what we're seeing here is essentially a selection bias where we're including unvaccinated people and fourth dosers and leaving this is like 23,000 people. So really that's like 1/5 of our total population. We're leaving 80% of our population out of our analysis. We're including 20% in the unvaccinated camp, and then we're zooming in on this little 1.5% of fourth dosers who immediately after the release of this dose are being given to people who are extremely vulnerable and have a high rate of death. But then as time goes on and more people get it, the death rates go down and they start to absorb vulnerable people from other categories, which drives down their rates. If getting more vaccine makes you more sick, then why do these rates go down over time? If the fourth vaccine is responsible for the harm we see here, why, even though the recipe didn't change, does the rate go down so much as time goes on? It seems like this is more a measure of who is sick and vulnerable than it is whether the vaccine actually hurts you. As more people get the fourth dose, the second and third doses don't become safer. The sick and vulnerable people who are likely to die move to the fourth dose category.